What's good, Modern Retro Show fam? Teacher Eddie back with another history reaction. So you guys have been asking me to do more videos about the Cuban Missile Crisis and specifically simple history. So I figured, hey, simple history, Cuban Missile Crisis. There you go. Killing two birds with one stone. So let's get into this one.
Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cold War, October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the moment during the Cold War when the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, came close to nuclear war. Secret communications and miscommunications which played out between the White House and the Kremlin made the crisis a unique event. After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 by the Kennedy administration, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev reached a secret agreement with Cuban Premier Fidel Castro.
Well, let's talk about a couple of things here.
After the failed Bay of Pigs.
So the Bay of Pigs invasion. So unlike what Jakob said in the Billy Joel song, Bay of Pigs invasion, it wasn't literal pigs. Okay, so the Bay of Pigs invasion took place under the Kennedy administration. Again, Kennedy's inaugurated in January of 1961. But the Bay of Pigs was actually planned out during the end of the Eisenhower administration. So it was Eisenhower's plan, actually. Because Fidel Castro overthrows Batista in 1959 for control of Cuba after the Cuban Revolution. So right away, the United States, for fear of the spread of communism, because that's what the Cold War was basically about. Right, from the American perspective, it was the fear of the spread of communism because communism was spreading out throughout the entire, Soviet bloc in Europe, China, now Cuba, of course, was going communist, and eventually the Vietnam War becomes, again, a fight over the spread of communism. So to have Cuba so close to home, because Cuba's only 90 miles away from the United States, the plans began to get rid of Castro, and they become really wacky as time goes on, including exploding cigars like it's Looney Tunes. But the Bay of Pigs was the big one. So the United States trained a bunch of Cubans who were, of course, displaced by Castro's regime and trained them for an invasion of Cuba to take Cuba back. Kennedy reluctantly agrees to greenlight the mission, but unfortunately doesn't provide the proper support, including air support, which was vital, and it was an absolute disaster. I mean, an embarrassment to the United States.
Pigs invasion in 1961 by the Kennedy administration, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev reached a secret agreement with Cuban Premier Fidel Castro to place Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba to deter any further U.S. aggression. For some time, the Soviets had been sending surface-to-air anti-aircraft missiles to Cuba, but President John F. Kennedy did not protest. However, he warned that if offensive weapons were sent to Cuba, that the gravest issues would arise. On October 14, 1962, U.S. U-2 spy planes took several photos showing sites for medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic nuclear missiles under construction in Cuba. Nikita Khrushchev, who had promised not to send offensive weapons to Cuba, had been lying. To help him deal with the...
Now, it also wasn't, again, because we're looking at it from the American perspective, but I always like to show how history is viewed from the other side of the coin. Right, just like when I teach students the Revolutionary War, I of course teach it, from the American side and the patriotic side, but also show them, well, what about the British? How did they view this? Because you can also say to the British, like, oh my God, look at these petulant Americans. We just fought a war, for them and are asking them to chip in, and they're going ballistic, right, over a simple tax. So it wasn't just that Khrushchev decided to put, missiles in Cuba just because. It was a retaliatory position because the United States had done the same thing in Turkey. And Khrushchev, or as we Russians call him, Khrushchev, Khrushchev was very much asking the United States, fam, could you, maybe get those missiles out of Turkey? Like, kind of too close to home, So that, it was in retaliation to that. It was kind of like a tit for tat, so to speak.
The crisis, Kennedy assembled a team called the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or XCOM for short. At first, they favored bombing Cuba with debate over the scale of the attack. The president decided upon a middle course, and on October 22nd ordered a naval quarantine of Cuba, the term quarantine being used instead of blockade, as blockade assumed a state of war existed.
Yes, this was Kennedy, for however you view his administration, of course, it's such a short administration, of course. Kennedy's in office, barely 2 years, right? He's inaugurated in 1961, and he is dead on November the 22nd of 63. So his administration, while short, did have a huge impact, and this was the biggest one. His handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis was nothing short of genius and presidential. I often shudder to think of the what-if scenario. What if Richard Nixon had won and he was in power for the Cuban Missile Crisis? I shudder to think on the outcome of that one. Kennedy was facing opposition the entire way, from the generals, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Everybody was calling him basically a lightweight. And this was a man who not only served his country, but served his country bravely. So that was unfounded. But everyone felt he was being too soft. But he was such a tactician in this, and he held his ground, and he handled the Cuban Missile Crisis like a boss. And again, calling it a quarantine instead of a blockade seems like it is all the difference in the world. All the difference in the world.
Existed. Kennedy sent a letter to Khrushchev stating that the United States would not permit offensive weapons to be delivered to Cuba, demanding that the Soviets dismantle the missile bases and return all offensive weapons to the USSR. He also went on national television to inform the public of the crisis, in which he said, "It shall be the policy of the nation to regard any nuclear missiles launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union." On October 24th, Khrushchev responded to Kennedy describing the US blockade as an act of aggression, and the Soviet ships sent to Cuba would be ordered to keep going. Some Soviet ships turned back, and others proceeded. They were stopped by the US naval forces but were discovered to contain no offensive weapons. Nevertheless, US reconnaissance flights over Cuba indicated the Soviet missile sites were nearing operational readiness. With no clear solution to the crisis, the US forces were put at DEFCON 2. On 26th through 27th October, Khrushchev sent Kennedy a message stating that the USSR would remove missiles from Cuba in return for a promise from the United States not to invade the island. Resolution to the crisis was now looking hopeful, but later, a second letter was sent by Khrushchev which provoked debate again. It demanded that the deal would also require the removal of US Jupiter missiles from Turkey. That same day, a US U-2 reconnaissance jet was shot down over Cuba. Kennedy prepared for an attack on Cuba within days as they searched for any remaining diplomatic resolution. That night, Kennedy ignored Khrushchev's second message and
This was a huge deal, all right? This was a huge deal. So there is still speculation to this day what was happening in the Soviet Union at the time. The modern belief is that Khrushchev was willing to basically, just say, all right, you know what? We agree it's escalating too much. As long as you promise not to invade Cuba any further after the Bay of Pigs, we'll take our weapons out. But then it's the second message, and most believe the second message was not sent by Khrushchev, that the second message was pressure from the people surrounding him for the fear of that he was being too weak with Kennedy, and that Khrushchev was kind of being held hostage by his own government, and they took a much harsher stance. So they debated this, I mean, very, 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 very much. I'm talking about Kennedy, his brother, Robert Kennedy, Robert McNamara, and his trusted advisors, and they came up with the brilliant solution of just saying, ignoring the second letter and just going with the first, right? Again, all these points seem kind of simple, but they're very shrewd. It's chess, not checkers here. And, the whole situation with, the missiles in Turkey being brought back up and everything else. So they took a much harsher stance. And most believe is because Khrushchev was not really the one in control at that point. And after the debacle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, they always say it's like, Khrushchev blinked first. He gave in to Kennedy. And Khrushchev pretty much lost all respect throughout the entire Soviet Union for his handling of the missile crisis, whereas Kennedy was, viewed as a hero. And the Bay of Pigs invasion was quickly forgotten after that.
Diplomatic resolution. That night, Kennedy ignored Khrushchev's second message and proposed to the Soviet Union steps for the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba under supervision of the United Nations and a guarantee that the United States would not attack Cuba. Attorney General Robert Kennedy was sent to meet secretly with the Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin,
yes,
and indicated that the United States were planning to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey anyway, and within 6 months. This was to be kept top secret.
Yes.
The next morning, on October 28th, Khrushchev issued a public statement that Soviet missiles would be dismantled and removed from Cuba. The crisis was over. The world escaped nuclear war in October 1962, largely because of the cautious natures of Kennedy and Khrushchev. In 1963, a telephone hotline was set up to give instant contact between the two leaders, and a nuclear test ban treaty was signed. In 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed, meaning the superpowers promised not to supply nuclear technology to other countries. Subscribe to see.
So yeah, very well done video. Again, they don't go into great detail, but I enjoy these videos in Oversimplified, especially if Oversimplified would stop sending me copyright strikes. I'd really appreciate it. But that's why I've been holding off on doing any Oversimplified videos until our appeal process with them is taken care of and a decision is made. But I love these videos, or like Bill Wirtz, because they don't have to go in depth. It's just sparking your curiosity with the subject and then making you want to learn more about it. But this was an absolutely pivotal time. This was the most pivotal moment of the entire Cold War, because this was the closest that the two superpowers came to full-out war. And there were also many other instances during, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And again, the crisis didn't last that long. It was several days, a little over a week. And again, even with the blockade, so to speak, or again, the quarantine, right? They didn't call it a blockade. And that's why for years after, even my mom asked me the other day, she's like, are Cuban cigars still illegal? Because the quarantine, so to speak, lasted. It just didn't go away after 1962. So the import of anything from Cuba was halted. So that's why you couldn't get Cuban cigars for decades and decades. And there were, a few standoffs between ships where, it just came super close, during the entire crisis. But again, it was the shrewdness of Kennedy as much as it was the openness of Khrushchev, even while he was being held hostage by. But again, we found out much later on about the top secret meetings and the meeting that Kennedy had with the Russian ambassador, where they did cover up the fact that the missiles were removed from Turkey for many, many, many years. It wasn't something that was publicly acknowledged. Whether it's true that, well, we were going to take those missiles out anyway, unlikely. So there were some, at least, accommodations made on both sides. But it was an absolutely fascinating point in history and a very scary one because of how close we actually came to what could have turned into a nuclear war. So absolutely awesome video. Love this subject so much. Love the entire, 1960s. Probably the most fascinating decade culturally in the United States out of the entire 20th century for me. So again, leave those requests in the comments below. And if you haven't done so yet, also please join us on Discord. Everything is hopping on there. We can continue the conversation. And of course, if you want to support the show, there's always patreon.com and other support links in the description. So we're going to shout out the Patreons, and I'll see you on the next show. And of course, always shouting out the Patreons on every show who keep things running here. Alan,
Chad,
Alex,
Mama,
Aaron Shepard,
Big J Trabina,
Christopher,
Dallas,
Freeman,
Nathan,
Rasmus,
Viking Nerd,
and Wouter. Thank you guys so much. I've been Eddie.
and I've been Jacob.
And we'll see you
Next time.